Hello, good evening. This is the LaRouche Pack Weekly Friday webcast for Friday, January 17th, 2014. I'm Jason Ross, and I'll be moderating the event this evening. We are joined, as always, by Mr. Lyndon LaRouche, as well as Dennis Small and Cody Jones, who will join me in posing questions to Mr. LaRouche. The first question comes in from an institutional source, and the questioner asks, Mr. LaRouche, in light of Obama's weakened status, how will this impact efforts to hold the Geneva II Conference on Syria, complete the Iran P5+1 negotiations, and reach a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine?
On the answer to these three questions in particular, or three-part question, in the first instance, the Geneva II negotiation on, if to be effective, on Syria, is first of all, Syria must be restored to immediately free powers as such, but under advisement and assistance, which are friendly and cooperating assistance. Otherwise, on the P5+1, you have a same kind of thing in terms of Iran, a similar kind of thing, not the same. Iran has and should retain its full sovereignty as a nation, and all agreements should be focused on that, achieving that result, the assurance of that result. Now, the issue of the two-state solution between Israel and Palestine is a more complicated question. Had the government of Israel still been under the deceased president, then we would not have the difficulties we've had under his successors since. The factor of those successors and their role in causing his demise by their actions intended to cause his demise through stroke in the period of 8 years ago has resulted in an Israeli government, of a right-wing Israeli government, which is merely an appendage of the British Empire, which has destroyed the integrity of Israel and its relationship within the diplomatic system today. If that error in the current administration of Israel is corrected, and the negotiation of the Israelis with the Palestinians allowed to proceed in a rational and fruitful manner, there should be no reason from those quarters to cause dissent and confusion in dealing with other international problems. But that's not the end of the matter. The problem of the world today is that since the assassination of the chief diplomat of Germany, his elimination cleared the way through British intervention, which caused him to lose power, Bismarck. The cause to lose power did not start the threat of the state of warfare which has pervaded in the transatlantic region and beyond ever since Bismarck was ousted from office. Every step of the way, since the moment of Bismarck's expulsion from office, including every second since that expulsion, in all modern history, has plunged all modern history from that second into a world war system, which with its various internal pulsations has created the state of warfare in the planet, among the nations of the world, ever since then, throughout the planet as a whole. And what we're leading with today, including the corruption of the United States among certain of its presidents and by certain of its presidents, has put the world into a state of threatened thermonuclear fusion warfare. Now, still, on this day, on every moment of this day, henceforth until an improvement is achieved. And that's, in answering those questions, we have to situate both the questions and the answers to those questions in terms of that framework of general overview of modern history.
Well, thank you, Lynn. I'd like to ask Dennis Small to come up to pose the next question.
Good evening. In this era of warfare, since the demise of Bismarck politically, there has been a continuing campaign running up to the current danger of thermonuclear war, as you just mentioned. Syria has been one of the flashpoints which the British Empire had been manipulating to try to lead towards thermonuclear warfare. And that dangerous flashpoint for thermonuclear warfare in the more recent period has actually become something of a rallying point for war avoidance forces internationally, including elements in the United States around the military command, the Russian government of Putin, and other states, such as that of the Vatican most recently, to implement a joint policy of war avoidance. Just over the last week, we've seen, on the one hand, the Russian government sent the aircraft carrier Admiral Kuznetsov into the Eastern Mediterranean, not for war, but for war avoidance, to collaborate with military forces of the United States, of China, and of other nations, including Norway and Denmark, for the safe transfer of chemical weapons out to sea where an American ship is to dispose of those chemical weapons. We also saw this week an important diplomatic meeting between Secretary of State John Kerry, first with his counterpart from Russia, Lavrov, followed up by a very interesting meeting at the Vatican with the Vatican Secretary of State on the subject of Syria and war avoidance, an unusually long meeting of an hour and 40 minutes, where it was also established that briefings from Kerry would be transmitted to Pope Francis in light of his upcoming trip into the area. And there was also a conference in the Vatican on Syria and on the idea of bringing a lasting peace to the area based on an immediate ceasefire and a negotiated political settlement. The Vatican has, in fact, been playing an important role for the last year or two in making sure that the intentions of the British Empire and of its puppet Obama for launching thermonuclear warfare could not proceed along this Syria flashpoint. And between what the Vatican did and the Russians and elements in the U.S. military and intelligence communities, that problem was at least temporarily obviated in the course of last year. We see a general mobilization of war avoidance forces in the United States as exemplified by what has happened with the recent publication of ex-Secretary of Defense Gates's book, where he attacks the very premises of war launching by the Obama administration and the Bush administration before that as what he calls, in some cases, grievously wrong and also fantasy-ridden. Now, in discussions earlier this week, Lynn, you pointed out that as this peace process comes on, the British Empire is being driven into a desperate rage, which actually has heightened the danger of thermonuclear war, which you said will continue and worsen unless the underlying causes of that war danger are actually resolved. The question is, what are those underlying causes, and what is a war-winning strategy under these conditions?
Well, the problem is essentially global. The whole planet is one of those issues which, for the whole planet, there is no part of planet Earth which is not presently in jeopardy because of these conditions. And the observations in the question are, including that on Gates, the role of Gates, is absolutely accurate. The part on the British Empire as such requires some amplification. What you've already said is already correct to that point, but more must be added to it. Now, what Gates represents is a man who, on the brink of Obama's war in North Africa, the declaration of war without basis. And the enactment of a non-declaration of war as such, in the international community, of proceeding with guerrilla warfare for the destruction of Syria, of Israel, implicitly, because Israel would be destroyed if that war were to be continued. Israel could not withstand surviving the implications of the war which Obama set into motion and which Israel's present president, who is a damned fool, has aggravated. So that his prospects in his negotiations are foolish. But you have to look at them not only as Israeli foolishness as such within Israel or Israel's immediate neighbors, but you have to look at it on a more global scale, because Israel, so used under an incompetent rulership, government, now is in danger of committing mass suicide of Israelis brought upon themselves under that administration. Netanyahu must be removed from office, not because of our interests as such otherwise, or not for meddling in Israel's affairs, because he represents, in the current strategic situation, more of a disease than a man. And Israel must be cured of that disease if we must expect to have success in the search for peace. That would be a simple thing for the right kind of Israeli to consider putting into effect. I do not have the authority to throw him out of office, but I can suggest strongly to competent Israelis, like the one that died, actually brutally driven to his death when he tried to prevent a certain course of risky warfare through his demise. Prevented from doing so. He was punished for that. And he was driven to his demise for his refusal to commit an act of strategic stupidity respecting the interests of Israel itself as well as its neighbors. So you cannot start saying negotiating in a context where Israel is still being led, while this bum still remains the leadership in Israel. His removal, and back to the even the kind of faulty performance of a leader of Israel who was punished in the succession by driving him to death repeatedly by certain rabbis and others. That which led to the Netanyahu travesty, and that has destroyed and corrupted the destiny of Israel ever since. And I speak as a person who is devoted to the promotion of the proper interests of Israel from the time I had completed my military service in World War II. And under the administration which had followed, which made many errors in the immediate post-war period, the intention, the quality of intention, the quality of a search for a proper intention by what was called the socialist leadership in Israel was a tendency which I did not direct in, did not dictate, but which I honored as moving in a direction which was positive and constructive. And I would say today that the ills that Israel has suffered as a result of that change of government from the socialist, so-called socialist government to the conservative government, the right-wing government actually, has been the cause of the worst things that have happened both to Israel, strategically speaking, and as a nation ever since. And that has to be taken into account. These are the kinds of things that which seem to involve smaller powers, which affect the world directly or very immediately or presciently. Urgent considerations today for the world as a whole.
Okay, well, let me ask a follow-up question on that, because I was going to ask this later, but it seems to be the topic, about Ariel Sharon. Now, You just spoke about Sharon's stroke, the lack of an opportunity for him to have a Rabin moment, you might say, and the pressure from the right-wing rabbis at that time. For those who haven't been keeping up with the website, over this last weekend you released a paper which at first glance surprised many people familiar with you. The paper was called In My Defense of Ariel Sharon, in his memory. So I'd like to read a response from a supporter in Italy and then read some quotes from a follow-up paper you wrote and ask you to elaborate. Here's an example of some of the questions that came in. Dear Mr. LaRouche, I've read your obituary for Ariel Sharon, and it seemed to me that you were somehow indulgent about the man who, in his life, presided over the invasion of sovereign states, the systematic crushing of Palestinians' rights, the destruction of cities, and the mass killing of civilians. I have followed you for many years, and your publications have consistently exposed these things. I admire you and respect your judgment, but I am now puzzled by your calling for blessing, quote, what is to be blessed in the shaping of the necessary outcome of his life. Could you help me to identify what is to be appreciated in the work of Sharon's life? Now let me read a few quotes from your follow-up paper, which you called A Report on an Unusual Production. You discussed your relationship to the earlier self-identified socialist governments in the post-World War II Israel, and about the British Empire's meddling in promoting the right wing and its role in creating religious conflict. And the points you raised in that paper are really quite beautiful, and I'd like to read a few quotes and ask you to elaborate. So you wrote, however, he remains a man, and to that point, that is the reason I have chosen his memory as a most useful choice of a key for exposing the cause at the root of his and many other victims of the same type of self-inflicted error of their ways as his own. You wrote, the subject of my view of Ariel Sharon today is a specific lesson of a cause of a soul which has died, but whose soul could now never speak, and as the souls of the truly greatest scientists and poets have spoken still, even lustily and vividly, even after the mind and body have long deceased. You wrote, we must cherish what should have become the truly assigned destination of his soul, but lament and despise its apparent outcome in his practice, at the end of his known consciousness, up to the point that all known redemption of his soul's opportunities had been quenched in a meaninglessly final death. You say that without a prescience of a posthumous efficient immortality, the living individual, any living individual, were a virtually already dead man, walking through the limited stretch of no more than his own mortal existence. So you really used it as a platform to raise some very profound thoughts on human immortality. Could you please elaborate?
Yeah. The great defect which is implicit in that history of Sharon, which is why I made such a fuss about it, because it was not merely what was at stake, was not merely the question of Sharon's fallibilities, and they were not what has been represented as Sharon and his character from Israel and other sources since that time has been predominantly an outright lie. He came under the influence of the right-wing turn in Israel itself and rose to a specific qualification in government which was dependent upon consent to the right-wing replacement of the earlier governments. That is the shift from the original government of Israel in the post-war period to its successors, the right-wing government. Under the right-wing government in Israel, even leading parts of leaders of Israel who had continued in offices of some authority, like diplomatic offices, into the 1970s, were actually under the control of the British Empire controlled state of government of Israel. Under that state of government, the Israeli who are victims as statesmen and similar kinds of function under the right-wing government, which was British-controlled from the top down and thoroughly. It was controlled internationally by the British-controlled right wing, even among Jewish communities which are outside this immediate area of contribution. In the United States itself, the right wing of Israel was used by the British, as in the 1970s. In my experience, the attack on me from in the United States in the 1970s was launched by the British government in its extension inside the institutions of the United States. I mean, people who were in the United States were considered the United States, but were actually predominantly British agents in terms of international policy and even domestic policy in the United States in the 1970s on. For example, in 1980, and before 1980, I had been in cooperation with a group of American leaders who had been who traced their origins to Franklin Roosevelt's role in World War II. The Truman administration had eradicated practically everything they could lay hands on in terms of the policies of the United States under Roosevelt, by substituting instead a policy which was an abomination and actually had the effect of treason, which is called the Truman administration. We finally got this bum Truman out of office. We introduced a president who was of different inclination, who represented the leadership of the United States during World War II, and who represented a military tradition of command in the United States, which is well established historically as the characteristic of the foundation of the United States itself. So we went from the American tradition, which had been often violated under certain presidencies in the meantime. Such as, Jackson was one of the worst examples of the worst kind of president. And the presidents after Jackson were all bad presidents and represented bad presidencies. Lincoln restored the United States to reality, to its Constitution, and to its inherent intention since the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. That's us. We are not something of a passing party. We are a republic which took its birth in the colonization in North America and continued through the history of mankind all the way through. That is our Constitution. That is our national Constitution. And the ebbs and flows and abuses and errors in the meantime are just exactly that. We today are still the United States, despite George W. Bush Jr., or George Bush Jr., and George W. Bush before him, and the Prescott Bush who sired this generation. They were all scum because they were all accomplices in terms of the enforcement of the influence of the British Empire on the functions of the United States, even the presidencies of the United States. So that's the context of this matter. So therefore, that's the way we, as representatives of our government, of the foundations of our government, and the Constitution which those foundations contributed, with some European participation, to creating our United States, is my policy. And I have enough history and enough knowledge of this to know that. I know what the history of the United States is. I know what its prehistory is better than practically but a few people inside the United States itself. And I speak with the authority which that carries. And that's my opinion on this aspect of the Sharon problem.
Thank you. So for the next question, we're going to shift from the Atlantic side of the world towards the Pacific side of the world, and I'd like to ask Cody Jones to pose the next question.
Hi, good evening. Now, yesterday in The Hill magazine, a paper that's circulated in Washington, D.C. and also on the internet, they had an article concerning some recent remarks from Richard Trumka, head of the AFL-CIO, the largest union in the United States. And what he said is that he will be listening closely to the words of Barack Obama. which is sort of, to me, is like listening to fingernails on a chalkboard. But nonetheless, he said he's going to be listening to hear if Obama will be echoing the sentiments that he himself, Trumpka, has about the state of our nation's infrastructure and what should be the level of investment. And Trumpka called for upwards of $1 trillion or more, with a capital T, of investment in infrastructure. Now, what Trumpka then said is that in talking about a recent trip he had to China, he said, "Today, the U.S. has not a single mile of high-speed rail, while China's high-speed rail system carries as many passengers as the entire domestic U.S. airline system." And he cited this as an area which the U.S. could greatly improve on. Now, it should be noted that we just heard that the current omnibus budget that's being proposed has removed every single dollar from the budget that was intended to go for high-speed rail. So according to the current budget, that's dead in the water. But what Trumpka brings up in terms of the direction of China is really only part of the story as it refers to high-speed rail. What we've been discussing, as you have emphasized, is the recent landing on the moon on the part of China, where they have emphasized that this is not simply just a show. This isn't just a demonstration of for show, but that in fact this has a very definite policy orientation to it. That their intention is to use the moon as a base for mining, for among other things, helium-3. And helium-3 offers the greatest potential for the development of fusion power. Now, to get a sense, perhaps, of the relationship of the moon program of China and their intentions moving forward for fusion power, look at the new director of the space program for China, Xu Dazi. I may be probably pronouncing that wrong. But not only is he the director of their National Space Administration, but he is simultaneously their director of atomic energy, as well as simultaneously being the director of the State Administration of Science, Technology, and Industry for National Defense. So you have under one umbrella the head of the Atomic Agency, the Space Agency, and Technology for Defense, which gives you an idea of an orientation that China has of a unification of these fields. And as we've seen, China's been investing heavily in fusion research development. Currently, China is developing and has one of the only superconductive tokamak test facilities, the other one being in South Korea. Now you counterpose that to the United States, which since Obama has come in, we've had the killing of the Constellation program, which was first proposed by Bush and, despite its budget problems and other things, was a certain kind of coherent idea for getting back to the moon as part of then movement on to Mars. And it was just a greatly expanded revival of NASA and the U.S. space program. That has since been killed by the Obama administration. And the only thing being put forward is this very nebulous idea of an asteroid deflection, which the asteroid hasn't been chosen. There's no real clear path as to how we're going to achieve that. And it's really all being done in the guise of a cut budget and a move towards privatization of space activity. You couple that with then the cuts to the fusion budget, where institutions like MIT, a leader in what was U.S. fusion development, is now losing all funding for its reactor program. The Princeton facility is having to lay off 100 or more people as their budget is also collapsing for fusion research. So you have one direction in China towards space, towards the mining of helium-3, the development of fusion technology. Not to mention that they just successfully tested, as they say, a hypersonic missile, which the U.S. has not even been able to do at this point. So you counterpose that to what's happening in the U.S. with a collapsing space program, no real clearly defined mission, cuts in funding for infrastructure, cuts in funding for fusion energy. And it shows a real dichotomy of policy orientation. So given that, what does this portend for the future of not just the U.S., but the world?
Well, to start with, I should emphasize that my views are my own, but they also are a part of what our basement organization is producing in process in terms of their scientific function, which is not just theirs, it's their participation of members of the basement team, as it's called, which is a specialist in these areas of physical science. And it has been, in the tradition, it emphasized more on the biological development, the biological history of life on Earth, which was the original intention, focus of intention, of the basement team in its original form. We use that experience in terms of the biological history of living species, which pertained also to the context of those living species, which was not only on Earth, but with respect to international developments, such as the relationship of the system of our solar system and to some features of the galactic system. These were the subjects which we considered during the period our leading emphasis of scientific work, actually scientific work as opposed to other commentary work, of the regional basement organization. I have been essentially, since a recent time, a few years ago, I have been an active part of emphasis on, in particular, in emphasis, the political processes associated with fundamental scientific global responsibilities for science within the range of the solar system, with great emphasis on the area, not exclusively, but emphatically, from the area of the range of the Mars, history of Mars, the history of Earth from that standpoint, the study of the moon from its structures, which have been a scientific achievement which I did not make, but I accepted and adopted. And also, more recently, the immediate prospect for the continuation of man's power to exist in the solar system, including the defense of Earth from within the solar, from the threats inside or near to the solar system. Those are my areas. Now, on that basis, my concern has been, in terms, since the 1970s, when I became a participant in the leadership of the Fusion Energy Foundation of the 1970s, my concern has been in a somewhat more specific direction in terms of emphasis. It's been more political. And my political emphasis led me to be a leading participant in the Fusion Energy Foundation during that period. And as subsequent to my involvement there, as a product of my involvement in the Fusion Energy Foundation, I went further with some support from members of the Fusion Energy Foundation and from others. This included leading people in the historically still living representatives of the original Roosevelt government, the OSS part of the U.S. government, then at that time. And so what happened is that my ties, which had been fairly long-standing at that point, to the OSS tradition and to the living survivors of that tradition explicitly, including what became an essential part of the Reagan administration as it was coming into power since 1978 approximately. And from that point on, I was also in collaboration with the leading representatives of what I chose as the people I liked among the OSS remainder and the people who were associated with that tradition as a tradition. That tradition was represented in the original composition of the pre-formation and the formation of the next presidential government. On that basis, I had continued during the 1980s in continuing the president. The SDI was defeated by the people associated with the vice presidency of Reagan's government. Reagan had been attempted assassination, comparable to that was inflicted on John F. Kennedy. So the Kennedy assassination, the attempted assassination, with the attempted assassination of his brother, who had then been nominated to be placed in candidacy for the U.S. presidency. He was eliminated by assassination, as his brother John F. Kennedy had been eliminated by assassination, including British sympathizers in the United States in powerful positions who were essentially British agents, but nominally American citizens, as well as British ones. So we pursued it. We were a great organization was effort, because when I proposed the SDI, which I did in concert with representatives of this tradition, this existing Roosevelt tradition, the OSS tradition, which is now forming the presidency with this particular function under that presidency. So under that presidency, I was designated by that group of people to lead the campaign for an SDI. And I had been a leading figure in the formation of the policy for the SDI based on that background. I was not the sole creator of the SDI. And not only did we have from the United States, with the approval of these people in the United States, as typified publicly by one of the greatest scientists in the United States at that time. So we were absolutely competent. We had the greatest competence that could have existed to demand, for the sake of humanity, the United States leadership in forming the SDI proposal. That included other interests, which are auxiliary to that. And out of that, it came my policy today. Therefore, if you take my entire history since my career, shall we say, in World War II to the present time, has been a continuity of an evolution of policy, which had deep roots within me and with my circumstances, to the present time. What I have been representing during that span and during that process now represents the best policy for the United States economically and in related matters today. We now have a president and his immediate predecessor who are absolutely unfit to occupy the position of President of the United States. I am committed presently to the expulsion of that worthless creature from that office, who is an impediment to the very continued existence of not only the United States itself, but to the avoidance of the danger, current active threat of a general thermonuclear war throughout the planet, its private scope at least. A war which, if not launched, would mean the probable extinction immediately of the human species. That's my policy. That's my take, shall we say, on the subject of what this thermonuclear fusion matter implies. The function of thermonuclear fusion for the history of mankind is not warfare among the nations of the world. That's not the point. The issue is of a much higher and less mortal importance. The question is, we have come to the point that the last relics of the roots of the British Empire must be exterminated from government throughout the earth. That can be done by cooperation among a few existing governments who decide that the transatlantic region of habitation and the Eurasian sector be brought together, not as marriage, but in cooperation. You don't have to marry every neighbor to have a good relation with them. Often the contrary is true. All too often the contrary is true. So therefore, that's what the context in which the question posed must be answered. Now the issue is that now, if we get rid of Obama, what is going to happen to the planet if we look at the planet in isolation? And what China has done in the most recent period, interval of time, is had to go to the moon for its own time. And in the dark of the moon, before the light had reappeared, China and its leading scientific institution of the China state had launched a new moon landing. This moon landing was a brilliant enterprise which it far exceeded the accomplishments of any attempt at moon exploration heretofore. But one of the greatest implications of that problem, that challenge, was the fact that on the moon there is a raw material which is dropped on the moon as a part of the radiation of thermonuclear fusion, essentially. That is of the helium-3. The helium-3, as radiated from the sun and accumulated on the surface of the moon, is now the most promising factor in planning the future of the life of the human species. This means that if we do what was implied by what that China team has done and has reported to mankind, at least to scientific mankind, if that is done, we are no longer Earthlings. Because the effective use of a resource which is not available to us in significant quantity on Earth, helium-3, if included as a raw material, as the core of a raw material, abundant on the moon to us, and we develop that, then if we transmit the benefit of that moon's accumulation of thermonuclear fusion, we are no longer Earthlings. Because we will not live on the moon, we will not live on Mars, not in any known future. But we can bring into a relationship, a functional relationship between Earth and the moon and other places, a new kind of relationship in which we are no longer Earthlings. Because we can, if we succeed in taking advantage of what the sun delivers to the moon as an accumulation, and apply that to the emission intention of thermonuclear fusion on Earth, that a successful application of the use of helium resources stored on the moon will create a quality of achievement in the development of thermonuclear fusion on Earth, which will change the history of the solar system. And that is my mission orientation.
Thank you. So the final question of the evening will be posed by Dennis Small.
It will, of course, much dismay the British Empire and their representatives here that we will no longer be Earthlings, because we will also no longer be underlings. And that is what they most desire that we be under the system with a Zeus eliminating any Promethean qualities in the human species. Now, all sane human beings love science, and they're excited, a kind of childlike excitement, by the new horizons that China's lunar landing and other space achievements have opened up for all of humanity. But there's more here than meets the eye. In your recent paper, Against Dictatorship, you again emphasize the seminal role that Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, the great 15th century thinker, in achieving what you call, quote, the greatest breakthrough in the emergence of a true modern physical science, close quote. And you add, I must now pinpoint the breaking point in history involving the matter of Nicholas of Cusa, which must be interpolated to make the implications of the China success in the moon landing intelligible to those modern scientists who, for the relatively large portion, have either a greatly diminished or essentially a non-existent grasp of the revolution in physics on which the actually underlying origins of modern European science and related matters depend currently." Close quote. Now, Cousa's breakthrough is not only that sense perception is false and that one has to understand that often non-visible causes or underlying universal physical principles that are the things that produce the effects which we otherwise perceive. And in that regard, this type of silly empiricism, one is often reminded of the cartoon, some of you may recall this, of the scientist who runs out of his lab in his white coat. He's got a mouse trap with a very dead mouse in his upraised hand, and he comes out of the laboratory yelling, "Eureka! Eureka! I've finally proven it. Cheese kills mice." Now, that is your typical university empiricist who revels in sense certainty. But what Cousa proves is not simply that man can correctly understand the physical universe out there. He proves that human creative reason itself is the highest causal force in the physical universe, that man's own creativity is the proper central subject of science, and that science is, in that sense, eminently subjective. Now, to quote you in your far more eloquent formulation of this matter, you say that the problem of, quote, physical science's current omission of the actually noetic qualities of the potential of the human mind is the problem. That omission must be considered as having created a reductionist's obstacle to the physically efficient characteristic of the actually creative principle. And I continue quoting Mr. LaRouche, "The power to efficiently employ the naturally given noetic abilities continues to rest upon that potential of the human to become enabled to foresee and actually know the future consciously." Close quote. So how do we unleash that love of science and of the future which Cousa bequeathed us in the population at large?
All right. To try to make this as simple as possible, because it's one of the richest areas of thought, of scientific thought inclusively, but also of spiritual thought within the history of the species, of the human species. Now, in physical science, in the ordinary course of things, in the history of modern science, we have, for example, a case of a handbook of physics and chemistry. The essential lesson to be adduced, despite all the vacillations in the course of interpretation, of the work of that particular handbook of chemistry and physics, which has a long history and a ponderous history at now. It has an ebb and flow of quality of interpretation of its mission. Sometimes it gets very close to truth, and then it turns around and has an opportunist element of corruption in the interpretation of the very facts, evidentiary facts, which it actually produces. So that you cannot take the handbook of chemistry and physics over its history as Bible. You can take it as something you observe because of a truthful current which underlies a certain part of the structure of the progress in development of modern science, which the handbook in chemistry and physics reflects, but does not perfect. There's an ebb and flow in the quality of relative degree of perfection in that handbook, which has to be taken into account. Now, there's a basis for this deviation, both in the failures of the handbook of physical and chemistry and what that represents, and also in other respects. And that's what this leads to. Mankind is unique. There is no living species known to us which has any essential agreement with the principal characteristics of living animals. living species generally on Earth. We have in official science, we keep essentially, in the common practice of physical science, while we have evolution, there's ebb and flow in the idea of science, even though there's an underlying current of evidence, which has always been true. It's a reflection of man's progress. But man's progress is not situated in practical considerations. The human species is not definable as a practical living species. The human species is only definable in terms of the human species. And the human species has no ontological coherence with the idea of the animal species, or plants, and so forth. In other words, a human being is absolutely different than any other form of what was called animal life, and always was, and probably will always be. So we, the human species, as a species, are determinant of the future existence of mankind and of the consequences of the existence of mankind. That's continued. Any other view is intrinsically, scientifically, systemically incompetent. Unfortunately, that is the incompetence which permeates elements of what is taught as science today. The green policy is an absolute fraudulent, pretension. There's no truth, but only evil located in the green doctrine. And any scientist who's really honest knows that. Only the unscientific or the corrupt scientist would accept the green policy. No competent scientist would ever support what is called the green policy of the United States and much of Europe today. It's absolutely garbage. Not only is it garbage, which would be bad enough, but it's poisonous garbage for mankind as a culture. And that's why people are dying in the United States under the Bush and Obama administrations, presidencies. That's why they're dying, largely because of the green policy and its British-directed implications. It's British imperial-directed implications. And it was created just like the policy of the British Empire now, under the Queen. The Queen's policy is the systemic elimination, reduction, and so forth, of the present human population of the planet from the range of approximately 7 billion people to 1. And that explicit prescription is the policy, officially and internationally, of both the Queen, the monarchy, and the British Empire. That does not mean that everybody in the British Empire supports that kind of criminal insanity, when it is, in effect, criminal insanity. And people who partake of it are partaking of criminal insanity inside their own heads. Especially scientists are especially criminal because they are repudiating the fundamental principle of honest science. And that's what the problem is here, essential problem. Now, where's the root of the problem? What I've described is the absolute truth about the history of the human species. There's nothing I've said now here on this subject presently, under this topic, which is false, or even significantly mistaken, except by omissions within that context. Not omissions as such, but omissions within that, errors by me, or omissions by me in that context. Everything else I've said is true about that context. That's what I don't know yet is the only problem. But what I don't know lies within the confines of what I do know. And only something consistent with what I do know as the history of mankind's progress. Now, the first thing about this whole thing is that the human species is defaulted because it does not accept that principle. It thinks that mankind is merely in a higher evolved form of an ordinary animal. And most people and most laws in most governments of the world have been precisely that. Now, that division between truth and fraud is defined by the oligarchical system, which dominates humanity still today. In most nations still today, The only way you get a struggle for improvement or reverse of crimes and despotism is when you make an exception to the oligarchical tradition, and an exception which forms, as did Christianity itself, against the Roman Empire. And the model to understand crime, criminality against virtue, is to look at the relationship of the Christians, as others, but the Christians in particular, and the Roman Empire. The difference between what? Zeus and Prometheus. Now, how is that expressed? That is expressed by the fact that the human species is capable of creation, and no willful creation, and no other known living species have ever done that. And therefore, the human species has the power, a very distinct power, the only power that efficiently defines a functional distinction between animals and humans. That function is called human creativity. Human creativity means, in its realization, wherever its realization is effective, is that mankind foresees the future. As they be able to forecast the actual potential of change in human behavior which will create the future. And without that ability to forecast among living human beings, like for example, Max Planck and Einstein, were people who foresaw the future, as many great minds before them had exemplified as exemplary, and as unique, relatively unique. Human minds which actually know how to think as human minds creatively. Every human mind that can think creatively rather than deductively, and deduction and creation are enemies in that respect. There is no agreement between deduction and creativity, and human creativity. Only those who have the capability of human creativity, as I happen to, as many other people have in my work, and they have theirs, who have a truly scientific outlook, as I have. We have people who have much greater scientific power and outlook than I've ever achieved. But I have the same quality of outlook as they do. Whether they are much greater than I am in this respect, or I'm less than they are in that respect. But we both occupy the same, and that is called the Promethean world outlook. And the Promethean world outlook only exists among those persons who have that foreknowledge of the future. Not as a guess, but as foreknowledge. No actual principle of science has ever been established except by one with that Promethean talent within them. And that's what I do.
Well, thank you very much, Lynn. I'd like to conclude the event with an announcement, which is that this weekend, on Sunday the 19th, marks the 50th anniversary of the Requiem Mass performed for President John F. Kennedy. The Schiller Institute will be performing Mozart's Requiem in that same church 50 years later. That'll be on the 19th in Boston at 3 o'clock at the Cathedral of the Holy Cross, and I hope as many of you as are able will be able to join us. So thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Dennis and Cody. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you later.